Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment and Health Science Talk Series as we celebrate our 30th anniversary year. My name is Lu Ying Wang, UNU-INWEH's Public Outreach and Education Associate, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's Science Talk. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, our Science Talk showcases the diverse, policy relevant, and interdisciplinary research of UNU-INWEH and our global network of experts. The sessions are designed not only to share cutting-edge science, but also to explore how that science translates into real-world solutions for water, environment, and health challenges around the globe. Today's session, like all of our talks, is being recorded. The video will be made available in an open access format following the events. And you can find recordings of all previous science talks on demand via our website and YouTube channel at UNU.edu/INWEH/science-talks. We're also pleased to have these new options of YouTube live streaming, making it easier for everyone to join our science talks. So there is no need to register to watch live. Simply go to the UNU-INWEH YouTube channel and click on our profile picture to access the stream. As always, we will conclude with an interactive Q&A session. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat at any point during the presentation, and we will address as many as possible towards the end of today's session. Today's science talk is entitled Blue-Green Infrastructure to Enhance Flood Resilience, Priorities for Implementation in Uganda and Rwanda. And it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Erik Nilsson. Erik Nilsson is an associate senior lecturer in the Division of Water Resources Engineering at Lund University and a member of the Faculty of Engineering in the profile area of water. His interdisciplinary research spans across water supply and management, climate change, food security, agriculture, and sustainable development, with particular attention to communities in the Global South. In this science talk, Erik Nilsson draws on comparative research in Uganda and Rwanda to identify the key barriers and opportunities for implementing blue-green infrastructure for flood resilience in rapidly urbanizing cities based on desk studies, field visits, and stakeholder workshops. He highlights common challenges related to policy and regulatory framework, institutional coordination, and financing, alongside opportunities such as public-private partnerships, land availability, and growing awareness of BGI benefits. Erik further presents a practical framework for assessing barriers and opportunities to support the wider uptake of BGI in rapidly urbanizing African cities. Please join me in welcome Erik for today's science talk. The floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Lu Jing, and hi colleagues at UNU-INWEH and everybody else in the chat online. And thank you for that rich introduction. So I think we've already covered what this talk is about, blue-green infrastructure for flood risk reduction or flood resilience. And as Lu Jing mentioned, I work at Lund University, but also specifically want to mention that we're also now connected to the United Nations through United Nations University Hub that we have here at Lund University, where I'm working with both research and teaching. But okay, so now over to today's talk, and I would assume that most of you are familiar with the basics of both drainage systems and blue-green infrastructure. But the key motivation behind this research and talk is that we see in many cases that urban flood risk is increasing. And there are a couple of main drivers connected to this. I think the top ones are population growth, but not only that population is growing, we also see that there's rapid urbanization, densification in urban areas. And on top of this, we see climate change and climate variability. So all in all, this paints a quite complex picture of urban planning, but also specifically flood risk reduction in urban areas. So we have both complexity, but also uncertainty in urban flood risk management due to these drivers listed here. And commonly, this has been addressed by gray infrastructure. We see some examples here in the image. And I think this has been working for urban areas in many ways. But we see more and more that it doesn't seem to be sufficient for the new challenges that are now posed on flood risk in urban areas, both in terms of capacity, but a main argument for blue-green infrastructure is also that gray infrastructure usually lacks these additional benefits that we can see from blue-green infrastructure, be it water quality, recreational components in urban areas, livability related, and so on. So it's in this context, the blue-green infrastructure, sometimes also connected to nature-based solutions in some areas is another common term, comes up as a potential solution to these flood risk issues and these contexts. And I think most of you are aware of the basic definitions of it. You see some main examples here on your right. And in general, is using either vegetated or permeable areas to improve retention, detention, infiltration, evapotranspiration, but maybe also water reuse in the stormwater systems. So the main argument here for using blue-green infrastructure is that this could act as a complement to grainy infrastructure, probably not replacing it completely because we see so much capacity being carried in the gray systems. But we see it as a complement, and especially while also providing other ecosystem services that the gray systems do not do. So depending on the type of blue-green infrastructure you're considering, this could be related to cooling, particularly relevant now with heating or increasing heat or extreme heat conditions. But it could also be recreation, water quality components. But at the same time as blue-green infrastructure has this strength of being multifunctional, that also acts as a challenge or as a limitation for implementation, because that also means that planning for evaluating, maintaining blue-green infrastructure through this multifunctional landscape also requires additional coordination. So that means that the mandates to govern blue-green infrastructure, assessing the benefits, estimating and covering the costs for blue-green infrastructure will be spread across sectors and different stakeholders. So I think that is one of the main reasons why while there's so much potential for blue-green infrastructure, we often see that the implementation is lacking. And I think it comes down to this combination of issues here, that's how to manage this multifunctionality. So specifically for this study that me and my colleagues were working on, so we tried to address this by specifically looking at what are the known barriers or barriers and opportunities for implementation of blue-green infrastructure in flood-prone cities. And we looked at cases in Kampala and in Kigali. We also had a case in Lund, in Sweden, but I'm not going to cover it in this talk. So here I also want to highlight that not only did we look in these case studies, but this is now all conducted by a team of researchers. So it was me and another colleague from Lund University, but we also had our expert colleagues from either Makerere University and Sif Magume, or from University of Rwanda, Umara Garbawali and Marie-Léonce Mouré-Boyire. So the results that I'm going to present here will mainly come from my colleagues from Makerere University and University of Rwanda, but I'm going to try to compile it in a way that is easy to understand. And I think worth noting here as well that this research was enabled by funding from the African Research University Alliance and Universitas 21, specifically targeting early researchers or early career researchers. So that's a bit the background of the study, and just a bit more specifically what we try to add to the literature of blue-green infrastructure is to not only look at the technical components, but to have a wider societal understanding of both what has been working for blue-green infrastructure, but also under which conditions might they work in future scenarios. So that means looking both at the evidence base for previously implemented measures, but then also considering what are the related institutions for governance, and also what type of investment has been used, but also could potentially be used in future conditions. And here's an overview of the methodology. So this was now connected to the specific funding that we had from Ottawa and Universitas 21. So what we did in the case studies and the research team, we had this structure of different methods. So step number one was to conduct the literature review or desk study. So previous publications, reports on implemented measures, listed stakeholders in the different cases. After this, to conduct field visits. So to visit sites, either for recent measures or especially flood-prone areas in the case areas. And then after this came the main component of the study, namely to organize stakeholder workshops in the case study cities. So that meant one stakeholder workshop in each case, inviting the key stakeholders and essentially getting their perspective on what are the main barriers, what are the main opportunities from their perspective. So number 3 is really the main method used in this study. And to arrange all that work, because we can imagine there are many different types of barriers and opportunities related to blue-green infrastructure. We use this framework for analysis of BGI implementation by Deely et al. So we looked at, or we categorized the identified barriers and opportunities along these 5 themes that we have here: sociocultural, knowledge, technical and biophysical, funding and markets, and institutional and governance. So here again, we can see that we have this quite broad definition of what type of factors will be relevant to understand both barriers and opportunities for BGI implementation. Okay, so that was the main core of the study, the workshops. To also validate the output from the workshops, we also conducted expert interviews, so a bit more in-depth interviews with experts that we couldn't do during the workshops. And then at the end, there was a synthesis by the research team to identify, based on all of this body of knowledge coming out of these methods, which barriers and which opportunities seems to be the most important ones. And based on that, how do we both make suggestions for enhanced implementation of BGI, but also how can we improve research on BGI for future studies? Okay, so that was the overview of the methodology that we used. Here, I just want to give a short overview of the flood risk profiles and the BGI context in the 2 case studies. But I don't want to go into this in detail. All of this information is easily accessible to all of you online. So I just want to highlight a couple of components here for Kampala and Kigali. So what I think is established from previous studies, we know that there is both high and increasing flood risk in Kampala. Hundreds of thousands of people affected. There's also some estimates of the economic damages due to this. And by previous literature, the main drivers identified are insufficient drainage capacity, that they're also increasing hard or impervious surfaces, lack of maintenance, blockages, but also a changing climate. On the BGI side of Kampala, we see that there has been measures implemented, but in many ways it remains limited. So we can see that BGI has been recognized as a method in the Kampala Drainage Master Plan from 2016, where there's now suggestions and integration of different types of BGI measures. And we've also seen specific implementations. We have this Greater Kampala Integrated Flood Resilience Partnership, where there were specific suggestions of how BGI could be implemented, connected to guidelines and also the type of pilot systems that have been installed. For Kampala, I also want to highlight that one of our colleagues here from the research team has also done hydraulic modeling studies showing that there is a high potential to reduce flood volume by using rainwater harvesting systems, reducing both the flood volume but also the duration. So we can see that some measures have been implemented, and we also see there's been previous research working on this. Okay, so moving over to Kigali, and we see here an image of, and if anyone of you know what it is like in Kigali, we know that it's a very hilly landscape, but also lush as it is in Kampala. But in Kigali as well, we see high and increasing flood risk, connecting to these main drivers I listed before: urban growth, steep terrain, intense rainfall, climate change, growth of the impervious surfaces. In Kigali, there's been a bit more implementation of BGI. So there's been both large-scale wetlands, urban greening projects, and some of those examples are listed here. But we also see from previous research that although there has been implementation of some large-scale BGI, it seems to be insufficient to address the flood risk. Specifically in Kigali, we also see that there's some incentives for and initiatives for green urban development. So we can see these pilot neighborhoods specifically targeting climate resilience and green conditions, be it upgrading of informal settlements or establishment of new neighborhoods. Okay, so that's the bit that brief overview of the flood risk profiles and the 2 case studies. So now I want to get back to the data that we collected and the methods that we used. So I mentioned the main methods here: the field visits, interviews, and stakeholder workshops. So here are just some examples of what the research team visited. And we can see again that there are many cases of use of vegetated areas, large-scale detention ponds or wetlands in these cases. Now coming to the workshops, which I said was the main component of this study. So what we targeted in the respective case was both the public authorities, so the experts from the public authorities mainly involved in this BGI process or urban planning, but also the universities and related professional organizations, be it from the water sector or urban planning sector. We had roughly the same amount of participants, 22 in Kampala, 23 in Kigali. And after this, we complemented, as I mentioned before, with more in-depth expert interviews. In Kampala was the Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development. And from Kigali, it was this organization, Green City Kigali, connected to the city of Kigali, specifically tasked to develop these green areas in the city. So here, this is a bit more detail of the methods, and now I want to jump right into the identified barriers and opportunities. So there's going to be quite a lot of information here on the slides, but I don't expect you to capture all of this right away. As Lujing mentioned before, this presentation will be available, and you're happy to come back to it later. Or otherwise, you can also go to the associated publication that we have coming. But let's start with Kampala. So here again, we see on the furthest left column these 5 themes that we used. And then listed here, so this is just taking whatever was mentioned now by the stakeholders from the workshops, they're just listed here. So they haven't been assessed or ranked in any way. They've just been polished a bit to remove potential overlap and then listed here. So we don't need to go through them in detail. You can just see here there's quite a lot of both barriers and opportunities connected to these respective BGI themes. I just want to summarize this.
Hi,
sorry.
Hi, Erik. Sorry to cut you off. We couldn't hear you clearly just now.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now it's getting better.
Okay, sorry. I was just summarizing, saying that here we see all these different factors identified by the workshop. And I'm not going to go through them in detail, so I just want to summarize this for the presentation. So for Kampala, we see that 25 barriers, 27 opportunities were identified. And briefly to summarize it, I would say that the main constraints or barriers from Kampala, according now to the stakeholders at the workshop, seems to be lack of evidence and monitoring, lack of access to urban land, be it that it's expensive or not available, lack of public funding, and fragmented institutional coordination, were I think the some of the top barriers. On the opportunity side for Kampala, we saw that already some of these strengths or opportunities for BGI has already been included in institutional framework and governance in Kampala. So we can see that blue-green infrastructure is mentioned and encouraged in physical development plans, drainage master plans, and we've also seen some cases of pilot projects. So there's been some development and some recognition of this as a way to address these issues. And now looking at Kigali. So same here, I'm not going to go through it in detail. I'm just going to look at this little summary box below. So roughly the same amount of barriers and opportunities, maybe a bit fewer, came out of the Kigali workshop. And we see that the main barriers, or what is most oftenly mentioned, seems to be connected to technical capacity. That could be of both practitioners, but also the professional community around the measures. The physical conditions, I think that was mainly about the steep slopes and the intense rainfall patterns that we have in Kigali, but also difficulties in the implementation processes, if it's fragmented coordination or lack of ownership. Similarly to Kampala, we see that some enabling conditions or opportunities seem to exist. For instance, a bit more in Kigali than in Kampala, we see large-scale pilots having been implemented. There's also some community structures in place where communities are already encouraged to participate in maintenance and of blue-green infrastructure. Some funding mechanisms connected to green financing and public-private partnerships, and both land tenure and environmental regulation is quite well developed in the Kigali case to support further implementation of the BGI. So here we see all of the different barriers and opportunities. So then, as I mentioned before, what the research team did, and this here now comes more from my colleagues in either Kampala and Kigali, based on all the factors identified, they identified or selected what they thought were the top ones. So I want to spend a bit more time on the top ones here for Kampala, looking at first the barriers in Kampala. So one, I mentioned it before, the limited evidence on previous measures. So there's a lack of pilot studies and also limited documentation on the performance of previous measures. One particular thing with Kampala was that in many cases, it has been seen that actually the communities, when there's been implementation of public infrastructure, they expect high compensation to when that is addressed in land that they are using, which has also acted as a barrier for further implementation. Scarce land and high expensive for land requirements was mentioned before. And number 4, limited public funding. So what has been seen is that much of the budget and funding related to stormwater management or flood risk goes into either existing or new gray infrastructure rather than blue-green infrastructure. And the last one identified was limited institutional commitment, if it's being due to lack of ownership, but also maybe lack of vision or just a lack of budgets for BGI within the related organizations. So if these were the top ones for Kampala, I just want to move over now to the ones in Kigali, and we can maybe already see some similarities and some differences here between the cases. What was specifically mentioned in Kigali was a lack of technical and design skills. So this is now more looking at the practitioners, the engineers, the implementers, that they seem more familiar with gray infrastructure, and that also acts as a barrier for further implementation. The hilly or steep slopes, the hilly terrain or steep slopes of Kigali was mentioned before, meaning that maybe guides or implementation support for BGI that works in other conditions might not work as well in Kigali because it's quite unique and difficult terrain to work in. In Kigali was also mentioned that urban development is happening fast, and the projects that get implemented also working on time-constrained implementation timelines. So that means that it's easier to continue working as they've always been working, and integrating a new way of working, such as BGI, would then expand the project phase, and that might not be feasible. Similar to Kampala, we saw that the next one here, limited public funding, was mentioned. So I think that's, we've already covered it. And the last one for institutional governance, we can see that it's a bit similar for the one in Kampala, but specifically overlapping responsibilities was mentioned. And again, it's what I mentioned in the beginning, that due to the multifunctionality of blue-green infrastructure, we also see difficulties from the institutional side working with that. Okay, so this was the summary of the main barriers. And now before going into the synthesis, I just want to briefly review main opportunities. But I think many of this we've already covered from when we listed all of the factors. But the top listed ones for Kampala was number one, training and capacity building. Mainly that there is already expertise within universities and some public authorities. But there's also potential to integrate this even more, as there's flexibility in the curriculum used at universities. So that could be an avenue to quickly integrate and build more capacity for blue-green infrastructure. Although in Kampala we saw that maybe land could be expensive, we also see that in some cases there is public land available. So that could, instance, be the universities hold large portions of land that could be adapted to blue-green infrastructure, but it could also be connected to the roads and transport system. Public-private partnerships has been maybe not implemented to the extent as it has been in Kigali, but it has been encouraged and recognized by the public institutions. So there seems to be an opportunity to include more of this in planning. The Kampala Drainage Master Plan, we mentioned it before, that in the plan and also in the physical development plans, BGI has been recognized, but there's now also specific recommendations for how the uptake can be increased. And last, also connected to a bit to the planning documents, we see that in some of these planning documents, I think this is also the Drainage Master Plan, that there is a requirement to add green space in new developments. So the numbers are, in residential should be 40% of the land, and in commercial space, 15% of the land is legislated to be green space. And now, last, the opportunities, the top ones identified for Kigali by our colleagues. Number one was the availability, both the extent of research, but the availability of previous pilot projects. So there seems to be a stronger base for evidence in Kigali on different scales, including large-scale wetlands that have been implemented. There's also already community mobilization through the Umuganda culture in Kigali, where there's monthly community work going on to do public services. And it has been seen that this could also be a way or channel to engage local communities to doing basic support and maintenance of blue-green infrastructure. Public-private partnerships are in many ways in place and has been implemented in several cases in Kigali. This is also promoted by public agencies as a way to access private funding. And the last two, I think I mentioned them before as opportunities for Kigali, both that the land tenure system is quite well developed, so that's also supporting other types of management of the land. And we also see that there's environmental regulation in place, and specifically that both protection and restoration is also integrated in the environmental regulation. So specifically, that's also something that could be tailored to support additional implementation of blue-green infrastructure. Okay, so we're getting closer to the end here of the presentation. So that's, I listed now both the summaries of the barriers and the opportunities, but also listed the top ones. Here, I just wanted to reflect a bit on the main barriers that seem to be shared or distinct between the two cases. But I think most of this is clear already. So again, if you want to go into the details, you can check the publication or look at the presentation later. but maybe just a few of them. We see, for instance, that there are knowledge gaps identified in both cases, but they seem to differ a bit. In Kampala, it's mentions of limited monitoring, limited evidence, but from Kigali, we mainly heard that there's a lack of this technical and design skills needed for implementation. Institutional fragmentation, funding constraints, and different development pressures in the urban areas were mentioned for both cases. And on the other hand, we have the shared opportunities. So to different extent, there is research being done. There are pilot projects, although maybe on the Kigali side, it has been a bit more. Different types of planning documents also recognize the importance of blue-green infrastructure. In terms of funding and public-private partnerships, it is recognized and supported in both cases, although maybe it's a bit more, or has been used a bit more in the Kigali case. And there are different examples of community engagement in both cases. So last, before trying to synthesize and come up with recommendations based on all of this, just want to list a couple of key distinctions that came out of this body of barriers and opportunities. So I think maybe this is already clear by now, differences between them. On the Kigali side, I mentioned it before, and there's this identified lack of design capacity. We also had the physical terrain of Kigali, that is the distinction. On the Kampala side, weak enforcement of already available regulations was mentioned more than it was in the Kigali case. And in Kampala, we see that there are difficulties in using public land, but at the same time, in some areas, we see that public land is available. And the last one for Kigali, we saw that green finance, public-private partnerships, and environmental regulation is quite well developed, and that maybe also differs a bit from the Kampala case. Okay, so this was now the summary of the results that we got from the interviews and that we got from the workshops. So based on this, I just want to show some examples of how one can now identify both implementation priorities, but maybe specifically research recommendations based on this body of knowledge. So the whole idea or the logic here behind identifying priorities is that based on the identified barriers and opportunities, one tries to identify different measures, initiatives that builds on the opportunities and addresses the barriers. So that could be done in many different ways, but I think only by looking at the barriers and opportunities from this case, one should be able to at least identify some priority recommendations. But of course, here one could also look within a broader body of literature to identify other types of initiatives that might be suitable in these cases. So here are just a couple of examples that I think we see map on quite well to both the identified opportunities and the barriers. So number one that comes up is the integration of BGI, but also the enforcement of BGI through environmental regulation. So that can be including it in urban planning, infrastructure development, and so on. Number two, that I think connects to many of the barriers and opportunities, is that there is a coordination issue within the institutional framework. So there is fragmentation and there is maybe difficulty to distribute the responsibilities and accountability for this process. Number three is connected to knowledge, capacity building, and evidence. We see there's a need for improved technical skills, but also an awareness and understanding of which type of measures are suitable in which conditions. And number four that I want to list, the last one here on this list, is connected to finance. So we can see in both cases, and we can see how that connects to many of the different factors. There is a need to mobilize finance, and there is a need to involve the private sector to implement these type of measures, but also to scale it up to address the challenges that these cities are facing. That was just a summary of how recommendations can be suggested. Here, I just want to point out, I don't want you to read all of this, just to show that these are the specific barriers and opportunities that I think are connected to these different recommendations. So again, it's just clarifying this, the method used here. Based on the barriers, based on opportunities, try to connect them as much as possible. And based on that, you should be able to identify suitable and also maybe new implementation priorities. And last, I wanted to mention, so here we see maybe what the shared ones are that I think could be done in both these cases, but probably more in a general sense, and at least in the region, but maybe also in other regions. Again, mentioning that there are, of course, some case-specific conditions that should be considered. So I just want to highlight here that for one, in Kampala, the issue of enforcement seems to be more prominent, and maybe a higher lack of performance evidence that we see in Kigali, and maybe also more development being needed for the financing. While in Kigali, maybe priorities should also be how to integrate blue-green infrastructure in this rapidly development planning process, building the local design capacity, and extending the already existing green finance mechanisms. All right, so a lot of information, and now I just wanted to finally say something about the research recommendations. So we've covered the background, the methods, the results that came out of it. The previous slide here was on the implementation recommendations. But especially me coming from the research side, I think I'm a bit more comfortable making recommendations for the research side. So I just want to give you briefly my suggestions for what type of research that I think would be effective and influential in these cases, but probably also in other blue-green conditions. So I think recommendation number one for research, what is needed, is that there is a lack of evidence on how will different blue-green infrastructure measures perform in different conditions. So on the first hand is to understand just from a hydrological point of view, just in terms of flood risk reduction, how will different measures, by designing them a different way, perform under different local conditions? So while the hydrology of that might not be very complicated, I think a lot of that locally adapted knowledge is not there. And advancing that knowledge would also then facilitate the implementation. So that's recommendation number one. Number two, I think maybe it's the most difficult one and maybe most important one, is to go beyond the hydrological sphere to also consider the multifunctional benefits. And this is where the investment case comes up. This is where the funding opportunities also come up. So coming back to the definition of blue-green infrastructure, as they aim to be multifunctional, that means that the research on them must also consider this multifunctionality. And that, I think, is generally lacking. We don't know how blue-green infrastructure performs economically across different sectors, across the different benefits that they generate. But if one can identify that in a reliable way, then one can also start building a business or an investment case, seeing where does these benefits lie, who are beneficiaries of these solutions. So two and last research recommendation, also coming into the governance and the political science component. This is not just a technical field, and I think to be really effective and influential, one must also consider the governance models around implementation of blue-green infrastructure. So that is addressing components like the institutional fragmentation or coordination on the other end, maintenance responsibilities, participation by different stakeholders, be it communities or private sector involvement. And I think both looking at these cases or other cases across the world, there are many examples, many different types of governance models that have been tried. But I think the research assessing that and maybe even quantifying the reliability of that could be advanced. And now, so there's been a lot of information. I just want to finish also building on the recommendations for research. So on the previous slide was the specific topics that I think should be prioritized. And here I just want to give an overview of how the research projects should be structured or could be structured to be also not only able to generate knowledge, but then also having an influential societal effect. So the key thing here is they should not only be constituted by universities or research institutes, but as this is now also an implementation in an urban space, it must also include a couple of other key actors. So here is just a framework that could be used to build these type of powerful research projects. They're also likely to have a societal effect beyond academia. And for the case of Kampala and Kigali, based on the meetings and the review that we had, I just listed a couple of which those organizations could be to build these type of interdisciplinary and powerful research groups. Lastly, now connecting, I mentioned it many times now, the lack of funding that's been mentioned by the stakeholders, how the research should also connect to the financial components. And again, here we can see that if we can assess these multifunctional benefits of blue-green infrastructure, that also means that the actors or stakeholders with financial incentives in these projects will also grow. So here I just want to suggest that as researchers, we can also look beyond the common research funding bodies that funds this type of research, and also identifying who are other potential actors that might benefit financially from this type of research. And those will then also be potential funding sources. So I just listed a couple of what I think could be the main types of actors involved in this process. And again, going beyond the research funding bodies, be it climate and green finance, development banks, but also the city authorities and public infrastructure owners that should see a direct benefit from this type of research. Okay, so here's my final slide. I know there's been a lot of information. If you have any questions around it, you're very welcome to contact me afterwards. So I just want to summarize with what I think are the priority recommendations, now specifically for the research component. So again, I think the number one focus should be this, how to integrate and understand the multifunctional performances of blue-green infrastructure. And the point of that is then to connect this to investment cases, be it for research funding, but then also for enhanced implementation. These research projects, to be influential and of good quality, they should be co-designed. So not just conducted by academia, but co-designed with end users. And I listed who they might be in the previous slide. And the last recommendation is this: by expanding the research groups and expanding the topics, that should also enable other types of research funding. So wherever there is lack of funding for research, I think by defining the research topics and building the research groups in a way might also then attract more research funding. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Erik. Thank you so much, Erik, for such an insightful presentation. Your comparison of Kampala and Kigali has shown us that blue-green infrastructure offers significant potential for strengthening urban flood resilience, but that successful implementation also depends on much more than that. For example, supportive governance, sustainable financing, local evidence, institutional coordination, and community participation. So I would like to begin with the question of financing and private sector participation. So you mentioned that public funding for BGI is often limited and conventional infrastructure often receives priority. So what would be needed to make sure BGI projects sufficiently attractive and credible to private investors? development banks and green finance institutions?
Yeah, thank you. And I think that might be the big question, how to create these funding channels to enable this type of measures. But I think I will kind of come back to what I ended with before. I think the key is to show what are the benefits, the multifunctional benefits of these type of systems. So that means assessing it across ecosystem services in different conditions. By knowing something about the performances there and knowing who the actors are that will be benefiting from them, that should also be able to build a stronger investment case. And that is interesting because I think there's a clear role for research in that process. So it means that research, addressing that complexity, collecting that data, developing the methods for that is what is needed.
Thank you, Erik. We have another question from our boardroom, from our colleague, Dr. Erik Nilsson.
Yeah, thank you, Erik, for the insightful presentation. I wanted to know who were the stakeholders.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
The stakeholders you interacted with.
The stakeholder what?
Who are the stakeholders?
So, sorry, did you say?
Yeah, so I wanted to know who were the stakeholders you interacted with.
The stakeholders in?
You interacted with in Kampala and Kigali.
Yes, sorry, the stakeholder list. So it was a combination of national planning authorities, city authorities, universities, also some green financing institutions. Do you want the full list, or are you wondering about anything in particular?
No, it's okay, because the findings, the challenges and opportunities you presented, I think they are all institutional or high level. And in Africa or most African cities, physical development is way ahead of the planning. The planning institutions are way behind development in terms of building construction, because individuals control what they construct. So I was wondering whether communities could be consulted here, because behavioral change and community participation would be a very good first step in terms of BG infrastructure.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I also think that's a limitation with the methodology, that we end up inviting the maybe the public authorities and the national authorities, because they're easy to identify and they're also interested in this type of collaboration. So we didn't have participation by community representatives at the workshops. So this was more based on the expert knowledge of my colleagues in the respective universities that they were supposed to represent that. But I agree, both adding that, but then also adding private sector stakeholders would improve the quality.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I have another question delving into the institutional coordination. So you mentioned that institutional silos and overlapping responsibility were identified as barriers in both cities. Which institution or level of government should take the lead in coordinating BGI, and how can responsibilities for implementation, monitoring, and long-term maintenance be clearly assigned?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure if I'm ready to suggest a specific institution, because it will be spanning, of course, anything related to urban planning is close, but so is water resources and environmental regulation. So I don't see one institution that is clearly there. So I think that needs to be negotiated on the local level, what that institution could be. But if I have to suggest something, would probably be municipal or city authorities. So in the case of Kigali, that I know better, is Kigali City, I think, has that broad responsibility.
Yeah. Since given you just mentioned about the local communities, how can cities ensure that BGI investments are benefiting lower income and flood-prone communities? In particular, residents of informal settlements rather than primarily improving wealthier or newly developed areas?
Yeah, it also feels difficult, but I think I know the Kigali case better. I know that the city of Kigali and the Rwandan authorities, they have done a lot to support development of informal settlements. So I think they have that within regulations. They have that as specific development goals, both on a city level, but also for the country. So I think that might be one way to do it, integrating it into the regulations. But then I think another component could be to also include that in the performance assessments, not just looking at the direct maybe economic bankability of the projects, but to look at the social effects of the measures. So I think that could be included in this multifunctional framework.
Thank you, Erik. And I have one last question to go about replicability. Which findings from Kampala and Kigali are likely to apply to other rapidly urbanizing African cities to a regional level, and which lessons are too dependent on the local institutional, environmental, or social context to be transferred directly?
I think, and especially the findings that we saw shared for Kampala and Kigali, I think they're also likely to be generalizable, definitely in the Eastern African region, but maybe also on a continental level. So I think we will see issues connected to institutional coordination. I think will be common. The difficulty of finding funding, understanding the multifunctional benefits of BGI. I think that's a common issue, and we need solutions addressing all of them. But we also saw that there were some specific conditions in the cases of Kampala and Kigali. I think Kampala saw the difficulty with accessing land, involving community, enforcing regulations seems to be a bit more specific for the Kampala side. While in Kigali, we have the particularities of the physical terrain, the steep slopes, and the intense rainfall patterns. Yeah, those are the ones that come to mind first.
Thank you so much, Erik, and for such a thought-provoking talk. And thanks to everyone for engaging our discussion. This brings us to the end of today's talk. If you enjoyed the session, remember that all of our previous talks are available on our website and YouTube channel. So feel free to revisit them or share them with your colleagues. We'll be back with another science talk exploring new ideas at the intersection of water, environment, and health. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next week's science talk. Have a wonderful day, Erik. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Bye.